Hey crew, we're back with some more Socrates. Today we're going to be diving back into the works of Plato. We're going to be diving back into the works of the dialogue of Timaeus. And we've talked up till now about the creation of the universe. We've talked about manifestation. We've talked about light coming from eyes. We've talked about all kinds of wild things. And now we're going to talk about the nature of the physical. And so let's just dive into the text. We left off with water, for its part, is when compressed with extreme force is dispersed by fire alone. But if the force of compression is weaker, it is dispersed by both fire and air acts upon the interstices. Fire upon the elemental triangles. And when air is forcibly solidified, nothing dissolves it except by acting upon its elemental triangles. And when the solidification is not forceful, only fire can break it apart. Now, when he's talking about the triangles here, bear in mind that this is his best way of describing something that he has seen, in my estimation. And he is describing the the atomic bonds of the elements. And the only way to change this element from this to this is to remove the bonds that hold it in place, whether that's isotopes and compounds or whether it's the raw elements themselves. The only way you can change it is if you change the makeup. And he's going on to describe in the best way that he can the force by which that happens. Now, he calls that force fire because fire is destructive in most people's estimation. But when he's talking about the triangles, that's his best way of describing how change happens, right? It's breaking apart the bonds that hold it together. All right, now this is a new text. And in the case of the mixed bodies composed of earth and water, as long as water occupies its interstices and these are forcibly pressed together, the particles of water arriving from outside, having no way of entering, flow around it and leaving the entire mass intact. Actually, we did this yesterday too. All right, so let's jump down to variegated. Well, the variegated forms, originating from the commonality in the shapes and their transformation into one another, has been presented quite well at this stage. So we should now attempt to indicate the causes whereby the characteristics they possess have arisen. Firstly, the characteristics we are discussing throughout must be perceptible, even though the origin of flesh and its accompaniments of the mortal part of the soul have not yet been described. In fact, it is not possible for these to be adequately discussed without reference to those characteristics that are amenable to sense perception, or to discuss the characteristics without reference to the senses. And while it is nigh impossible to treat both at the same time, so we should first make assumptions about one or the other of them and then return to those assumptions hereafter. Well, let us first presume the details relating to body and soul so that we may describe the characteristics in due order after the various kinds of substance. So let's first look at the way in which we refer to fire as hot. By considering the splitting and cutting, we notice it bringing about in our bodies. Indeed, we all perceive that the effect is a piercing one, yet we must deduce the fineness of the edges, the sharpness of the angles, the smallness of the particles, and the rapidity of its motion, all of which render it intense and incisive, always cutting acutely into whatever it encounters. We deduce this by remembering the origin of its shape, whereby this substance and no other, by splitting our bodies and cutting them up minutely, is likely to provide the characteristics we now call heat, and its name too. Although what is opposite to these is obvious, it deserves the description anyway. Now, when the liquids consisting of larger particles surrounding their body make their way in, they force the smaller particles out, but are unable to settle into the seats, thus vacated. They compress the moisture within us, rendering it immobile and solid, due to the uniformity in the pressure, whereas It had previously been non-uniform and mobile. But anything that is unnaturally contracted naturally resists the process by pushing back in the opposite direction. This resistance and shaking is called shuddering or shivering, while the entire quality and that which brings it about has the name cold. Hard designates anything to which our flesh yields, while soft designates anything which yields to the flesh. And they are also designated in this way with respect to one another. Whatever rests upon a small base tends to yield, and whatever is constituted of square bases is the most rigid form, since it is established firmly, and anything compressed to an extreme density would also be especially resistant. So this is just talking about the nature of relativity. Hot and cold are relative terms. Normally, we determine that according to us, right? So if it is hot, it is hotter than we are, and so therefore it is uncomfortable. And if it is colder than we are, and therefore it is uncomfortable. But there's no real defining line. Like we set an arbitrary number of 72 here for room temperature. And it can generally be a couple of degrees higher or a couple of degrees lower, depending on your particular taste. But it's fairly well established that 72 is comfort for most people. So anything above that is hot and anything below that is cold. But even then, it is still a relative thing. And that's what he's talking about here. And that's the same for most of our terms: soft, hard, light, dark, hard, soft. Uh, all of these things are relative to us. And therefore, what he is saying is to establish them with that. That's what he's doing. He's showing that I'm going to tell you about the body, but in order to tell you about the body, we have to just show that these things are relative to the body. And that's how we designate the outside world, and therefore it helps to establish what we need for our bodies. And the nature of heavy and light may be presented most clearly by considering them along the expressions up and down. Indeed, it is not at all correct to regard the universe as naturally divided into two distinct opposite regions, down being the one towards which anything with any bodily bulk is borne, up being the direction in which everything moves against its will. For since the entire heaven has spherical form, and extremities are situated at an equal distance from the center, and these, by nature, must be extremities in the same way, while the center, being situated at an equal distance from all the extremities, must be regarded as being in the opposite position to all of them. Now, since the world is naturally like this, which of the locations we have described may be designated as up or down, without being regarded, quite rightly, as using a name that is not appropriate. For the central location within it is not rightly described as either up or down. No, it is just the center, while the periphery is obviously not the center. Nor does any part thereof differ in its relationship to the center, nor to any of the points on the opposite side. But what sort of opposing names may be applied to something that is similar in every respect? In what way might it be properly described? Indeed, even if a solid body were equiposed at the center of the universe, it would never be borne towards any particular extremity, as they are all similar in every respect. No, even if someone were to proceed around it in a circle, repeatedly standing with his feet in opposite situations, he would refer to the same point on it as both up and down. Indeed, as we said just now, the whole is spherical in form, so it is not sensible to describe one location as up and another as down. As for the origin of these names, and the actual circumstances to which they apply, by reason for which we are accustomed to refer to the entire universe by dividing it in this way. These issues we must agree upon by making the following supposition. Suppose someone in the region of the universe that is assigned predominantly to fire, where most of it gathers and towards which it is born, were to stand up therein and had the ability to take portions of fire and place them in a scale and weigh them, raising the beam and dragging the fire forcibly into the dissimilar region of air. A lesser quantity of fire obviously would be forced more easily than a greater. For if two things are raised aloft by a single effort, the lesser must presumably go along with the force to a greater extent, and the greater to a lesser extent as it resists the process. So the large volume is said to be heavy and to be borne downwards, while the small one is said to be light and borne upwards. And again, this is just another way of looking at the theory of relativity and how, while this isn't directly dealing with time and energy conservation like Einstein's theory of relativity, this is the theory of all things are relative, right? There is no up and down. It depends on where you're standing. It's looking at the 6 and the 9, or the 6 wrote on the ground, and the other guy's looking at the 9 wrote on the ground. And from your point of view, you both are correct. It's telling you overall to try to maintain the thought in your mind that just because you see it this way does not mean that it is that way. And so it is possible that the things that I describe, he says, are not exactly as they are. Well, we need to discover ourselves doing the very same thing in our own region. Indeed, when we stand upon the earth, weighing earthly substances, and sometimes earth itself, we are dragging them forcibly and contrary to nature into the dissimilar region of air. In both cases, they cling to their own kindred, but the smaller bulk cooperates with the compulsion more easily and is first to follow it into the dissimilar region. Accordingly, we refer to it as light, and the region into which we compel it is up, and the characteristics opposite to these as heavy and down. Consequently, these must behave differently relative to one another because the vast bulk of the four types occupy a region opposite to one another. Indeed, upon comparing what is light in one region with light in the opposite region, heavy with heavy, down with down, and up with up, all sorts of direct or indirect oppositions and differences relative to one another will be discovered, some present, some coming into being. However, there is one factor to be kept in mind in all of these cases. The course towards what is kindred to each renders whatever transverses it heavy, and the region into which something like this is born down. The other terms are applied to those that take the other course. So let's declare that these are the explanations of those characteristics. All of that just to say that we are going to agree that what we commonly hold as up and down and heavy and light are going to be those things. As for roughness and smoothness, I presume that anyone would be able to discern their causes and relate them to someone else, but for one is produced by hardness combined with non-uniformity, and the other by uniformity combined with a dense texture. The most significant issue concerning the experiences shared by the entire body is still outstanding. The cause of the pleasures and the pains in those processes we have already described, and in any cases where the sense perceptions acquired through our body parts are also accompanied by inherent pains and pleasures too. Now we should come to an understanding of the causes of any process, perceptible or imperceptible, by recollecting the distinction we made earlier between the mobile and the immobile nature. Yes, anything we intend to discover must be pursued in this way. Whenever an impression, even a slight one, is made upon anything that is mobile by nature, it is transmitted in a circle, one part bringing about the same effect upon the next until it reaches the intelligence and proclaims the characteristics of whatever made that impression. So, if you get burnt, it's saying that there's a circle that is transmitted, like you burn your finger, and it's transmitted until it reaches the intelligence. And then the intelligence takes action. Well, that is exactly how it works. You burn your finger, and then neutrons or pain receptors or chemicals or whatever it is that's released, and it travels to your brain, probably moving in circles, because everything moves in circles. I mean, just think about the blood being pumped, right? It's pump, stop, pump, stop, pump, stop. So you got fluid flowing into the pump, and then it stops, and then it pressurizes, and then the pressure normalizes, and more flows in. So even that is an in-out toroidal circular motion. While in the opposite case, while the object is unmoving, there is no circular motion, and the object alone is affected without moving anything else in its vicinity, so that the initial impression is not transmitted from one part to another, does not move into the living creature in its entirety, and renders the impression imperceptible. These considerations apply to bone and hair and any other predominantly earthy parts of our bodies, while the previous considerations apply mainly to the parts concerned with sight and hearing because of the significant function of fire and air within these organs. Now, we should think about pleasure and pain as follows. When a sudden, forceful impression, contrary to our nature, is made upon us, it is painful, while the sudden return once more to the natural condition is pleasant. Any impression that is gentle and gradual is imperceptible, but the opposite goes for the opposite impressions. Anything that happens with ease is undoubtedly perceptible, and yet it does not involve pain or pleasure. Experiences associated with the ray of sight itself, for instance, which, as we said previously, constitutes a body that coalesces within our own in the daytime. For cuts and burns and whatever else it experiences do not produce pain in the ray of sight, or pleasure either, when it returns once more to the same configuration. Yet there are significant and detailed sense impressions corresponding to whatever affects it, and to anything that is impinging upon or comes in contact with. For there is no force whatsoever involved in its dispersal or reconstitution. However, bodies composed of particles larger particles yield with difficulty to whatever acts upon them, transmit the effects throughout their entirety, and have pleasures and pains. Pains when they are being alerted from their normal state, pleasures when they are being established once more in their original condition. In cases where they undergo gradual depletion and emptying, but the refilling is sudden and extensive, and the emptying process is imperceptible, and the filling process is perceptible, and this induces no pains in the mortal part of the soul, only enormous pleasures. An obvious example of our experience is pleasant odors, but cases where they are suddenly altered from their usual condition and reestablished only gradually and with difficulty, in their own original state, bring about the opposite outcomes to the previous ones. This is evident in circumstances where the body is cut or burned. So it is talking about the temporary nature of pain, right? And how pain doesn't affect sight. Right? Something can be painful that you see, be something really bright, like a welding rod or staring at the sun. Don't do that. Don't stare at either one of those. That's a painful process, but it's not really pain that happens with sight. That's interesting because what you get burned from is the after image of the sight into the physical that's actually the problem. Not to get pulled off onto a tangent. Um, but again, this is more description of the physical, right? This is how we perceive things, and pleasure and pain are. It's weird that you would feel pain, right? It's a weird thing that you would cut and hurt. It's perfectly natural and normal. I'm not saying it's weird like that, but it's weird to think about the thought that that cut provokes a response in your intelligence that doesn't necessarily exist in other places. Like you can see animals fighting and they don't pay attention to the injuries the way that humans do. It's just an interesting side note. So, But some are permanent and some are not, right? It's like if you get stuck with a pin, that's over fairly quickly. You get a finger cut off, while the initial impression of pain is over fairly quickly, right? You have lingering pain from the wound, but you also have pain from the missing piece. And all of these things are relative pains. They all are relative to you, and it's all due to our perception in the body that these concepts exist at all. All right. Although the experience is common to the body as a whole, and any names bestowed upon those who produce them have been described fairly well, we should still attempt to explain, if we can, somehow do so, what happens in various parts of our bodies, the associated effects, and furthermore, the causes involved in their production. First, we should clarify as best we can whatever we omitted from our earlier discussion about flavors, namely the particular experiences in which the tongue is involved. These experiences appear to originate, as indeed do most of the others, from certain constrictions and expansions, and additionally, they rely more than the others upon roughness and smoothness. For any earth particles that enter in and around the veins that act like probes for the tongue, extending as far as the heart, fall upon the moist, soft flesh, get dissolved, constrict the veins, and dry them up. And these appear harsh to us if they are particularly rough, dry if they are less rough. But anything that cleanses the veins and anything that rinses the region of the tongue is referred to as bitter. And when it exceeds the measure of activity so that it attacks and melts away the substance of the tongue itself, soda has this sort of effect. While those that are milder than soda and exercise the cleaning effect in due measure appear salty to us and more agreeable in the absence of that rough bitterness or bitter roughness. Those which combine it with the heat of the mouth and are rendered there smooth thereby become inflamed along with it and in turn burn the very thing that warmed them up. Then, being carried upwards by their lightness towards the sense organs in the head, they cut apart whatever they impinge upon, and because they possess these powers, all such substances are called pungent. Those particles that have become thin through decay sink down into the narrow veins and are duly proportioned to particles of earth and air that are in there already, so that they set them moving around one another and stir them up. And being stirred up, they form an enclosure. And as one kind of particle sinks into another, they produce hollows stretched around the particles that enter. So, when a hollow of moisture, earthy or pure, is stretched about air, it forms watery vessels of air. And those enveloped by pure water are transparent and are called bubbles. While in cases where the moisture is earthy, so that it moves and rises in a mass, we use the terms foaming and fermentation, and that which causes these effects is called acid. An effect opposite to all of those we have been describing is produced by an opposite cause. Whenever the configuration of the particles entering into liquids has a natural affinity with the normal condition of the tongue, smooths it out and covers over its roughness, contracts the parts that have been unnaturally dilated, relaxes those that have been unnaturally constricted, and settles them all, as much as possible, into their natural condition. Anything of this sort constitutes a pleasant and agreeable remedy for those violent effects, and is called sweet. Well, that is enough on this topic. Now, in the case of the power that belongs to the nostrils, there are no distinct forms. For all the smells are hybrids, and no single form proves to possess symmetry corresponding to any smell. Rather, the veins within us that are involved in these processes are more narrowly constructed than the kinds of particles belonging to earth and water, and are wider than those of fire and air, so no one has ever perceived a scent from any of these four. No, odor arises from the moistening, decaying, liquefaction, and evaporation of substances. Indeed, odors arise at the intermediate stage when water is being transformed into air or air into water, and they are all smoke or mist. The one proceeding from air to water is mist, while the one proceeding from water to air is smoke. Therefore, all odors are less dense than water, and yet more dense than air. This is most evident when someone impedes the inward breath and then draws his breath forcefully. Or, for when he does this, no accompanying odor whatsoever is filtered through, and then the breath alone enters in devoid of odors. Now, the varieties of scent fall into two categories, which are without names and consist neither of numerous forms nor of a simple few. Rather, we should speak only of an immediate, distinct, twofold division into the pleasant and painful. One roughens and does violence to the entire vessel that lies between our navel and the top of our head, while the other soothes this same region and lovingly restores it once more to its natural condition. The third seat of perception within us, the one concerned with hearing, that should be reviewed, and the causes of the experiences associated therewith should be stated. Now, we may propose in general that sound is an impact transmitted through the air, through the ears, brain, and blood, as far as the soul, and that hearing is the motion produced by this. That is true. A motion beginning from the head and ending in the region around the liver. If the motion is rapid and the sound is high-pitched, if slow, it is low-pitched. If it is uniform, the sound is even and smooth, and in the opposite case, it is harsh. If the motion is extensive, the sound is loud, and in the opposite case, it is faint. However, the factors involved in the concord of sound must be dealt with in later deliberations. While there remains a fourth kind of a sense of perception, and it is necessary to subdivide this, since enormous variations are included within it, which we refer to collectively as colors. A flame emanating from physical bodies, a flame whose particles are proportioned to the ray of sight, so as to bring about a perception. And in the earlier accounts, the causes whereby the visual ray is generated were just stated. Therefore, it would be most reasonable and appropriate to present a suitable account dealing with colors as follows. The particles born from the various objects and impinging upon the ray of sight may be smaller, larger, or indeed equal in size to the particles belonging to the visual ray itself. Now, those that are equal in size are imperceptible, and indeed, we say they are transparent. And the larger and the smaller constrict the ray in one case and disperse it in the other. And these are related to the particles that warm and cool the flesh, the astringent ones associated with the tongue, and those we refer to as pungent due to their warming effect. White and black constitute identical experiences to these, but in a different medium, and for these reasons the phenomena appear different. Therefore, they should be referred to accordingly. That which disperses the ray of sight is white, and its opposite is black. And when the more rapid motion belonging to a different kind of fire impinges upon the ray of sight and disperses it right up to the eyes, forcibly compressing and cutting the very passageways of the eyes themselves, it causes a volume of fire and water, which we call a tear, to pour out of them. This more acute motion, being fire itself, encounters fire, coming from the opposite direction, which leaps out of it as if coming from a flash of lightning, while the incoming fire is being extinguished in the moisture. And in this turmoil, a whole variety of colors are generated. We refer to the effect as dazzling. We call that which brings this about bright and glistening. And the kind of fire that is intermediate between these other two is not glistening, despite reaching the moisture of the eyes and mixing with it. And the beam of fire shining through the moisture with which it is mixed produces a blood color that we call red. Bright mixed with red, and white becomes orange, but it would not be sensible to state the extent of the measure involved in these, even if we knew it, since it would not be even moderately capable of proposing any necessity or any likely account thereof. And yet, red mixed with black and white is purple, or it is violet whenever these components are burned and more black is mixed with them. Orange arises from a mixture of yellow and gray, while gray comes from white and black, and ochre from a ochre from white mixed with yellow. White mixed with bright and steeped in an intense black produces a dark blue color, and dark blue mixed with white is light blue, while orange mixed with black is green. As for the other colors, it is fairly obvious from these examples what mixtures they should be attributed to, if we are to preserve our likely account. Yet, if some were to put these matters to the test through practical investigation, he would be acting in ignorance of the distinction between human and divine nature, whereby God has sufficient knowledge and power to combine the many into one, and then again to separate the one into many. But no human being is now, or ever shall be, adequate to either of these undertakings. So, at this stage, all have developed in this way out of necessity. The artificer of the most beautiful and best of whatever comes into being took these over when he was bringing the self-sufficient and perfect God to birth, employing the causes associated with these as subservient, while he himself fashioned the good into whatever comes into being. Therefore, we should distinguish two kinds of cause, one necessary, the other divine, and we should seek the divine in all things for the sake of attaining a life that is blessed as our nature will admit. And we should seek the necessary for the sake of the divine, reckoning that without these necessities, those divine objects are serious concern, are incapable of being discerned on their own, nor can they be apprehended or shared at all. Now that the two kinds of cause have been duly separated and lie before us like materials for a carpenter, we must weave the remaining account together from these two. Let's briefly go back again to the beginning, proceed quickly from there to the stage where we have just arrived at, and attempt to give a conclusion to our story at that stage. A crown befitting all that has gone before. Indeed, just as we said at the outset, these were all in a disorderly state when the God engendered symmetry in each of them, each in relation to itself and all in relation to one another, to the extent that, and in the manner that, it was possible for them to be proportionate and symmetrical. For at that time, nothing had a share in the proportions save by chance, and there was nothing at all worthy of being called by the names we now use, such as fire, or water, or any of the others. Rather, he first set out all of these in order and then constructed the universe from them, a single living being containing within itself all living beings, both mortal and immortal. He himself was indeed the artificer of the divine beings, and he commanded his own offspring to undertake the creation of the mortals. And they, imitating their father, received the immortal beginning of soul, and then fashioned a mortal body in a globe around it for it, and bestowed the entire body as its vehicle, and also built on another form of soul in the body, the mortal form. This contains fearsome, necessary experiences within itself. First, there are pleasures, the greatest lure to evil, and then there are pains, taking flight from the good. There is also rashness and fear, two unintelligent advisors. Anger, that is so hard to appease, and hope, so easily led astray. Mixing these together with irrational sense perception and a love that will turn its hand to anything, they compounded the mortal kind of soul in a necessary manner. And fearing that these might pollute the divine part, save when absolutely unavoidable, They house the mortal part of the soul separately from that, in a different dwelling place in the body, by constructing an isthmus and a boundary between the head and the chest, the neck. You can see mine if I pull my beard up, which they put in place so as to keep them separated. And then they fasten the mortal kind of soul within the chest or thorax, as we call it. Since one part of this is naturally better and another part worse, they built the vessel of the thorax for its part, making a division therein, as if they were separating men's quarters from the women's, by placing a midriff as a barrier between the two. Then they house the part of the soul that partakes of courage and spirit, the part that is fond of victory, closer to the head, between the midriff and the neck, so that they could hearken to reason and share with the task of forcibly restraining the tribe of desires. On occasions when they would not willingly consent in any way to obey the injunction of reason issuing from the Acropolis. So in the Century House they situated the heart, a knob of veins and a fountain for the blood that is borne relentlessly through all the limbs. Consequently, whenever the force of spirit boils up because reason proclaims that some unjust action is affecting them from the outside, or even from the internal desires, every sensible party of the body rapidly becomes aware of the exhortations and threats communicated through all the narrow veins, heeds them, and follows them unreservedly, and accordingly the very best part is allowed to rule among them all. That's the flight or fight response. That is the adrenaline response, right? When you're in danger and you hulk out and you lose control and you take care of business. That's what he's talking about. And considering the pounding of the heart due to expectations of terrors or the awakening of a spirit, and anticipating that this sort of swelling as the spirited parts was going to arise through fire, they devised a protection for the heart by implanting the structure of the lung. First and foremost, this is soft and bloodless, and it also has cavities bored through like a sponge so that it may receive air and liquid, having a cooling effect and provide respite and ease amid the burning heat. Accordingly, they cut the channels of the windpipe as far as the lungs and wrap the lungs around the heart like a buffer so that when the spirit bursts forth within the heart, it will pound against something yielding and be relieved, and being less troubled, it would be more able to join with spirit in the service of reason. As for the part of the soul that is desirous of food and drink and whatever else is held to be lacking on account of the nature of the body, that part they house between the midriff and the boundary near the navel, building there a sort of feeding trough for the nourishment of the body, occupying the entire region. And there they tethered this part like a conjoined wild beast that needed to be nourished if ever there was going to be a mortal race. So they allocated this location to it so that, grazing constantly at the feeding trough, housed as far as possible away from the part that deliberates, producing the least possible commotion and noise, it would allow the supreme part to deliberate in peace about what best serves the individual and the entire community. And they realized that it was not going to understand reason, and even if it were somehow to attain some appreciation thereof, it would not be in its nature to be concerned about any words, but would be utterly enchanted night and day by images and phantoms. God, seeking to exploit this particular weakness, assembled the structure of the liver and placed it in that very dwelling place, arranging it that it be dense, smooth, and bright, possessing both sweetness and bitterness. It was intended that the power belonging to the concepts emanating from spirit, moving in the liver as if in a mirror that receives impressions and produces visible images, would strike fear into the appetitive part. So, whenever this power makes use of a kindred portion of the liver's bitterness, bears down upon it strongly and threateningly, and rapidly spreads the bitterness over the entire liver, it projects bilious colors, contracts it, and makes it all shriveled and rough. What's more, it also bends the lobe of the liver from its proper state, constricts it, blocks and closes its ducts and apertures, and brings about pain and nausea. And yet, when some breath of gentleness emanating from the mind paints pictures of an opposite sort, it provides respite from the bitterness by refusing to set in motion or even to touch the nature that is opposite to itself. Then, making use of the very sweetness that is natural to the liver, it restores all its parts to their proper, smooth, and free condition, and renders the part of the soul housed in the region of the liver kind and gentle, spending the hours of the night in due measure by having recourse to philosophy while sleeping, since it does not share in reason or intelligence. Indeed, those who fashioned us, remembering the injunction of their Father when he directed them to make the mortal race as excellent as possible, even corrected the degenerate part of us in this way by establishing the prophetic power in the liver, so that it would have some contact with truth. And there is sufficient indication that God has bestowed prophecy upon unintelligent humanity from the fact that no one in possession of spirit attains to God inspired true prophecy, but only someone whose power of intelligence is fettered in sleep, or who is disturbed by disease or some frenzy. Rather, it is the role of the intelligent person to recollect and reflect upon the utterances from the prophetic or frenzied state, walking or dreaming, and upon any visions that were seen, and to decide by reasoning how and for whom these all indicate some present, past, or future, good or evil. However, it is not a task for the person who still remains in the prophetic state to judge the visions and utterances originating for himself. No, it has been well stated of old that it belongs only to the sound-minded person to know himself and do what is his own. Hence, it is the custom of a set of group of interpreters as judges over the God-inspired prophecies. Interpreters, whom some refer to as prophets in their own right, being totally unaware that these people are interpreters of the enigmatic utterances or visions, and may not rightly be called prophets, but interpreters of those who engage in prophecy. So then, it is for the sake of prophecy that the liver has such a nature, and it is located in the place we have described. And while each creature is still alive, such an organ as this retains more vivid indications. But when deprived of life, it becomes blind, and its prophecies are too obscured to indicate anything definite. Furthermore, it is for the sake of the liver to keep it always bright and clean that the organ next to it has the composition it has, and is positioned to the left, like a cloth supplied for a mirror, always lying ready by its side. So whenever any impurities arise in the region of the liver due to the bodily diseases, they are all purified and absorbed by the loose texture of the spleen, since its fabric is porous and devoid of blood. Accordingly, it fills up with impurities, it waxes large, and it festers. But then again, once the body has been purified, it reduces in size and subsides to its former condition. It's important to note that the purification rituals most likely include fasting and specific diets. I'm assuming that they had a specific diet for the liver and another one for the pancreas and the kidneys and for the various other parts of the body. They probably worked a lot better than the techniques that we use today. I don't know them specifically. I'm not a doctor. I can't talk on that at all, so I'm not going to try to, but most of that made sense to me, and it makes sense, especially when you think of it, if you think of it on a spiritual level. And these are men who, in my estimation, are holding a conversation on the astral plane. So they have somewhat of a grasp on how to do things, and they're letting you know that the solar plexus chakra right here is right around the liver, and if it is healthy and whole, it feeds you and it'll help you to get your prophecy, your pulling of your greater purpose to where it needs to be. As for the soul, the extent to which she is mortal and the extent to which she is divine, and how, in what company, and for what reason these two parts are housed separately. We could only ever insist that what we have asserted is true if God were to confirm it. But we should dare to assert, even at this stage, that what has been said is likely, and will prove more so on further investigation. So let that be our statement. And again, that is always my statement. I try to relay the information to the best of my knowledge. When I say that I know something or anything along that nature, I do try to point it out. I don't always. I am fallible just like everyone else, but it is important to do that, right? To say I could be wrong on things that nobody knows the answer to except God. Well, the topic that follows from these should be pursued on the same basis. This concerned the manner in which the rest of the body came into being. It would be most appropriate to attribute its construction to reasoning of the following sort. The race of gods who framed us knew that we would show a lack of restraint with regard to food and drink, and would consume them greedily, beyond measure or necessity. So, to prevent our rapid destruction through diseases and avoid the immediate demise of the still immature race of mortals, they anticipated these problems and put in place the receptacle we call the abdomen to retain the excess food and drink. They twisted the structure of the entrails around this so that the food would not pass through so rapidly that it would immediately compel the body to need food once again, thus producing insatiable desire and rendering our entire race unphilosophic and uncultured due to gluttony, heedless of our most divine part. Let me see where we're at on time before I get into... Yeah, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. We're about to get into... The next part is describing the physical construction of the bones and the flesh and all of the sinews and all of the parts that are related to that. And that's extensive, and it'll eat up a lot of time. And keeping people around for longer than an hour is a little bit hard, especially with some weighty topics like this. This is some heavy stuff, right? We're talking about relativity. We're talking about the physical construction of the body and the attribution of the senses and how the senses are divided into separate senses within the sense, how taste is divided into bitter and sweet, for example. And so this is very philosophical in nature, but it's also quite explanatory in nature. The things that he is saying is not incorrect to the best of his knowledge, right? He only had knowledge of 4 elements and yet describes chemical alchemy. It's something. And so this is great, right? I'm having a great time going through this. I know it is dry. I'm not going to get a lot of people to watch this. It's really not going to be the big thing that gets people up. I'm going to have hundreds of hours dealing with Plato, and nobody's ever going to watch it except for the few that make it this far. But the secrets of the universe are really contained within this. Now, he is only explaining them to the best that he can, but he is explaining some very, very complicated topics. Hopefully, I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to some complicated topics. I'm trying my best to convey my best knowledge to you, to relay my interpretation of these things. And I do read through it. Like I read through all of Timaeus, and then I read through the section that we're going to do today. But like I haven't studied this. This is us discovering this really together. And I'm enjoying it. So I hope you are too. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pit Steak. Peace.